Thank you very much for this introduction, Father Thomas. So I would like to speak, my entire presentation will be about something that the present one delivered by Dr. Kieran McNally takes for granted, which is that human beings come into existence within the evolutionary process. This is something, this is a topic where the encounter of philosophy and theology with this particular biological claim on anthropogenesis inspired the most emotional reaction to evolutionary theory and posed a considerable challenge to systematic and philosophical theology. And the history of the conversation here between science and religious worldviews on this very topic of hominization is long and complicated. Today, I would like to address two specific issues. I hope they won't be too technical, but I still find them very important, and I hope you will agree with me. First, I will delineate the contemporary Thomistic approach to the question of the origin of our species, and I will try to defend its theologically, I believe, theologically more accurate and precise version than the most prevalent definition that is of this view, which is classified as a semi-naturalistic position on the human speciation, which is supported by many theologians and is also present in official statements of the church. So I will try to maybe make it more specific and try to propose maybe a more accurate version of this understanding of this definition. Secondly, I would like to refer to the complex debate on mono versus polygenism. And here I will offer a critical evaluation of the contemporary version of the monogenetic scenario of the origin of human species. So first, I will begin with this definition, or Catholic Church's understanding of the human origins. So what happens here is the Church now accepts, after Humani Generis, accepts the claim that human beings come into existence within evolutionary transitions or transformations. But what I want to say is that the language that churches uses in order to define this very understanding of the origin of human species is deeply dualistic, which, and I will criticize it from the perspective of the Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, which is also dualistic, but it is not a substance dualism, but it is a metaphysical dualism of metaphysical categories and not a dualism of two separate substances, which in this conversation are body and soul. So this dualistic language is present from the very beginning of the response to evolutionary theory with respect to anthropogenesis. So 1 year after Darwin published his On the Origin of Species, there is a local synod of Cologne, where the local church there comes with a claim on evolution of the human species, where it says this: the first parents were created directly by God, and therefore it is contrary to sacred scripture and to the faith, the opinion of those who are not ashamed to assert what? That man, insofar as his body is concerned, came to be by spontaneous change from imperfect nature to the most perfect, and in a continuous process, finally becoming a human being. And to this, this synod adds that obviously the origin of the soul is divine creation, direct divine creation ex nihilo. So what I want to point towards in this formulation, from the very beginning, we have this statement that if evolution can do anything, it can prepare the body, and then the soul comes from God created ex nihilo. So we have this dualistic language from the very beginning. This is the most anti-evolutionary statement that came from the church. It was a local church. So putting aside the extent to which actually it is really anti-evolutionary, putting aside the lack of consensus as to whether the direct formation of the human body was treated as an article of faith or not, putting aside theological and cultural context of Germany at that time and what evolutionary theory meant for scholars and what was the conversation, what was the context, putting also aside the question concerning the level of magisterial teaching of this local synod, and eventually putting also aside, once again, the question whether this synod was actually answering to Darwin, which Kenneth Kemp claims it actually was not, because Darwin was not translated entirely into German at that point. Putting all this aside, and these are very important issues when you think about this first response to evolutionary theory, what interests me the most here is this dualistic terminology of this decree. Body and soul are discussed as if they were two separate substances. And we can see this language then is being in a way accepted by those now theologians who try to marry evolutionary biology and human and theological account of anthropogenesis. One of the, probably actually the first among them is St. George Jackson Mivart, a British biologist, a convert to Catholicism, who saw this difficulty and who was trying to bring peace between theology and biology. And he is actually the first one who now positively uses the same language that I mentioned about before. So he says this: Scripture says that God made man from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. This is the plain and direct statement that man's body, again, was evolved from pre-existing material, symbolized by the term of dust of the earth, and was therefore formed by the operation of secondary laws. Now, the soul of every individual man is created, produced by a direct or supernatural act, and therefore the soul of the first man has also it has to be created in the same way. But again, we see this distinction between body, evolution prepares the body, and God gives the soul. John Augustine Zahm, to give you another example, he was a Holy Cross priest, a scientist, professor of physics and chemistry, one of the first professors at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana in the US. So he also struggles with or tries to bring peace between evolution and theology, similar to Filippo de Filippi, an Italian naturalist, famous for his lecture L'uomo e la scimmia from 1864. So John Augustine Zahm, I will just bring one quotation from his important book Evolution and Dogma, where he says this: we should be obliged to revise the interpretation that has usually been given to the words of Scripture which refer to the formation of Adam's body, and read these words in the sense which evolution demands. Again, evolution produces body, God gives the soul. This language is then accepted by the official teaching of the Church, first in the person of Pius XII, who in his Humani Generis, in his encyclical letter, claims this with regard to the doctrine of evolution. The origin of the human body, again, we can think about it as coming from pre-existing and living matter. For the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. John Paul II, in his address to the Symposium on Evolution in, I believe it was 1996, he says, quotes or repeats what Pius XII has said: if the human body takes its origin from pre-existing matter, the spiritual soul is immediately created by God. Now, I think that the difficulty of this language is that, again, it is deeply dualistic. And what are then the problems of this formulation of the semi-naturalistic view of human origins? Well, you cannot have human body without it having a human soul. If there is Homo sapiens sapiens, you cannot have Homo sapiens, or let's say just Homo sapiens, who runs out there without a human soul, and then God says, okay, I have a body here that evolution produced, and now I will put a soul into it. Metaphysically speaking, it's not acceptable. Why? Because an already informed entity, a body, cannot receive an additional soul. If there is an animal body out there, it is an animal which has an animal soul in it, or is an animal soul which actualizes matter in this animal body. So you cannot add another soul. And this language that the church uses and theologians use may seem as if they were saying, or it may suggest, and I met many people who precisely think this way, that there is a separate body out there, and then God decides to put a human soul into this body. And the difficulty of this approach on the metaphysical level, or another aspect of the difficulty of this approach and at the metaphysical level, is that the proper correlate of substantial form, I want to emphasize it, substantial form, which is a metaphysical principle, must be another metaphysical principle, which is primary matter. So therefore, if we say that soul informs body, well, trying to be precise, we must acknowledge it is an analogical way of predication. What soul actualizes is primary matter, and it actualizes it in a way that what is right here is a human being, which is an organic human entity that has material and spiritual aspect to it, but not material substance plus metaphysical spiritual substance. Right? So it's not substance dualism, but it is a dualism of two metaphysical principles. Again, substantial form, which is my soul, and primary matter, which is a metaphysical principle of potentiality. One may try to defend this language that is being used by theologians and church documents, saying that, well, if God is truly transcendent and omnipotent, why not assume that there is a situation where we have an adult animal, and then God, brings a substantial change where this animal turns into a human being. So physically nothing changes, but metaphysically everything changes, because there was a hominin representative, and then now there's a human being. Well, God is omnipotent and he can do things like that, but I think that we would rather think that it is more convenient to God, who likes to work through secondary causes and in accord with laws of nature. It would be more convenient if God brings into existence the first human being in a way in which all new species come into existence, if we assume that those transitions from a metaphysical point of view are discrete. Where if they are discrete from a metaphysical point of view, they come into existence at the moment of conception, when primary matter is disposed properly within entire complex evolutionary process. It is disposed in a way such that when an ovum and sperm meet and join together, instead of a next representative of species S1 coming to existence, a new and first representative of the species S2 comes into existence, right? It happens at the moment of conception and not during the time when an organism is an adult organism. Okay, so therefore I would say that this picture, or this language where we say evolution prepares the body and God gives the soul, I think it's inaccurate. And I would suggest that first human soul was created ex nihilo, yes, at the moment of conception of the first human being or beings. And this soul, or these souls, actualized properly disposed primary matter, underlying gametes produced by male and female hominins at the moment of substantial change, which accompanies the moment of fertilization. So I would say, it's not that human body came through evolution and soul was added to it. I would say human beings came through evolution. which doesn't challenge in any way the truth that their souls are still created. The soul of a human being is created by God ex nihilo, and it actualizes primary matter which was predisposed within evolutionary process, and again is not added to a body that is somewhere there waiting, already being a human body. Marie d'Almac-Leroy was a Dominican who was the first one to think in this way, but he was unfortunately criticized by the church, like probably all others that I've mentioned so far. The church was very skeptical about those first attempts of trying to bring at peace evolution and creation. And he says something, I think, very important in his book from 1891. He says, it is only after the infusion of the soul and because of the infusion itself, I don't like the language of infusion, but he uses it, that man is constituted as a living being. Before infusing the spirit, there was nothing human, not even the body, inasmuch as human flesh cannot exist without a soul, which is its substantial form. So there is no human body. If I die, we don't bury a body, we bury a cadaver, which looks like a body, but is a bunch of substances that are dissolving pretty quickly. And actually we find a support for this claim, in Aquinas, first in Aristotle. Aristotle, in his Parts of Animals, he says this: when the soul departs, what is left is no longer a living animal. None of the parts remain what they are or what they were before, except in configuration. So it looks like an animal body, but it's not. So we can revert this and say it's impossible for a soul to enter an animal body, because if there's animal body, it is already a living organism. So it doesn't work this way, at least within this metaphysical framework. Aquinas has a long passage on this in his commentary to Peter Lombard, but shorter passage in Summa Contra Gentiles, where he says, again, similar like Aristotle, when the soul departs, neither the whole body nor its part remain of the same species as before. The eye or flesh of the dead thing are so called only in an equivocal sense. So in my 2019 paper, and it will also come in my upcoming book on evolution, I offered a model of how God acts in the speciation. And this model is very complex, so I don't want to discuss the whole thing, but what I want to emphasize in case of human beings, because I adjust this model, because it is a special type of speciation, truly substantial form is not educed from the potency of matter, like in the case of other animals. It is directly created by God, but it doesn't enter a living animal. It informs or actualizes primary matter, which is created by God as well. But this primary matter is disposed to receive or be actualized by this substantial form within the process of evolutionary transitions, where the last step of it would be two hominins, in this case, who produce, again, ovum and sperm, and they come together and produce, and the first human being comes into existence. So that would be the essence part of what this first human being is, and there's an existence part, but don't try to read it. It's too complex and it's not our interest right now. So that would be my attempt to clarify the position on what we should or we could understand by the semi-naturalistic origin of a human being, which is simultaneously a natural process within evolutionary transitions and supernatural in a way, or in this aspect where God creates the soul directly ex nihilo. By the way, it is still not a miraculous intervention. It is rather, in a way, a natural intervention, because there's no other way human souls can come into existence. So God is not changing anything in nature. This is the way he designed for human souls to come into existence. Okay, so now I move to the second part, where within the complex debate on mono and polygenism, so once we accept that human beings can come into existence in the evolutionary process, so then the question is whether it was just Adam or Adam and Eve, or there were more of them. So Here, I want to refer to the contemporary defense of monogenetic origin of the human species. Well, I will begin with a simple reminder that biology definitely favors polygenism. That was a view assumed by Darwin. And the modern 20th century evolutionary synthesis, which by the way is changing, and we believe that we are already the work is in progress on the contemporary, we will probably call it the 21st century synthetic model of evolutionary changes and transitions. But the one defined in the 20th century, that synthetic theory says this. This is Theodosius Dobrzański, one of the founding fathers of this theory. He says, species arise not as single individuals, but always as diverging populations and breeding communities. The difficulty, so therefore the most probable scenario is monophyletic origin of humans, but polygenetic, and most likely within this polygenetic scenario that might have happened in several regions of one larger population. The difficulty biology would have with monogenetic scenario would be this extremely narrow bottleneck, where the population would have to go down to, well, if we want to follow scripture fully, literally, to just one or two organisms. And then we would have to say, from the biological point of view, miraculously, when they become human beings, they grow and rebuild an entire population, which becomes a new species. So from a biological perspective, this is something that is virtually impossible. Therefore, Denis Venema, who is a biologist and geneticist, he says that humans as a species are descended from ancestral population of at least several thousand individuals, and he works on that in population genetics, on trying to model human speciation. So he claims that we have tools nowadays to speculate and in a way prove that there was even no it might be true that we know today that there was no significant change in human population. So we not only know the size of it, but we may be even probably sure that there was no significant change in the size of that population. So it's not only that there were several thousand, but we know there was no dramatic change in the size of the population. Now, those within the Christian and Catholic tradition who favor and want to defend monogenism, they bring a bunch of arguments that they say we have to take into account when we look at this biological evidence that I just shared with you. They say, first of all, that Genesis, the account, speaks about Adam and Eve, and that's about it. So we have at least one scriptural argument. There are other scriptural arguments. For example, in the Book of Wisdom, we read about wisdom that preserved the first formed father of the world when he alone had been created. Acts of the Apostles, Paul speaking in Athens, he says about God who made from one the whole human race. He says from one, he never says about one man, but he probably assumes that it is Adam that he has in mind. Well, this is scripture. Immediately, the question enters how you interpret scripture, whether you interpret it literally or not. But those who are in favor of monogenetic scenario, they say you shouldn't just, pass over it without a deeper reflection. Then we have humani generis, and I believe you are, and I hope you are familiar with this statement, a very important statement. So while the Pope says you can think, or we can think about the origin of human species in evolutionary terms, when it comes to polygenism, the faithful cannot embrace that opinion, which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him, and as from the first parent of all, which is actually not polygenism but polyphyletism. And then the other option is polygenism, where Adam represents a certain number of first parents and not just one first parent. So he says that it is impossible to embrace it because of the difficulties when we refer it to the teaching on original sin and St. Paul's analogy of Adam and Christ. Adam, who is the first one to sin, and Christ is the one who brings us back to unity with God. So the claim of monogenists would be this document closes the conversation. And there is a long conversation on whether it closes or it does not, but at least they claim it does close the conversation. Then we have the time here in Rome, 1966. Around that time, we have a number of theologians who actually work on original sin, also in reference to evolutionary theory, and they are actually thinking about this, what I quoted just a minute before about the statement from Humani Generis, and they feel, I believe, that maybe there is a need, an opportunity to rethink this theology of original sin and this analogy in St. Paul so that polygenism would be acceptable. And then the Pope organizes this symposium, and actually he opens it with this address where he delivers a strong, even stronger than in Humani Generis argument against polygenism. And I believe it might have been surprising, at least because I know the writings of those theologians who probably hoped for some changes, and I guess they were surprised by what he says, where he says that some modern authors, if you have it on the slide, they start from the undemonstrated hypothesis of polygenism and give, again, explanations of original sin. So always this connection to original sin is a problem. So not biology, but theology here supposedly is a problem for the Pope. Okay, so and the last argument on their side, and maybe there's more, but the most important ones, it is the argument from Mitochondrial Eve and Y from chromosomal Adam. I don't have time to get into this argument, but today it has been, so the claim is basically that we can, based on scientific evidence, we can go back to the first woman and the first man in our species. So scientists, they show that even if we can go and find the first mother of all of us that are alive here today, it doesn't prove that she was the only one human mother at that time. The same with the first father, which is Adam. So this argument is actually has a response which contradicts it, and it's not a valid argument anymore. Now, so those who argued in this way, as I have presented those arguments in favor of monogenism, some of them, they would say, okay, if science says something different, well, maybe this is the problem of science. We have to stick to theology, and this is what obliges us. These are documents of the church, period. But there are those, obviously, who say, no, we cannot go this way. And we have a difficulty here because the theology seems to be saying one thing and biology seems to be saying another thing. So we have a number of, and I would like to refer to three of them, theologians and philosophers who try to find a way to defend monogenism within or with reference to biological science and in a way that doesn't contradict biology. So the second one of them, and I begin with the second one because he defies terminology within this conversation, is Andrew Alexander. He writes a paper in 1964 where he distinguishes three, I call them phases of hominization, where first he says we may speak about the biological species, which is the population of interbreeding individuals. We heard this definition today already. Then he says we can distinguish it from the philosophical man or philosophical human being, where the philosophical human species is, or philosophical human being is a rational animal, which already is a natural kind, which already has the capacity for conceptual thought, judgment, reasoning, and even free choice. The only one thing that it lacks is the transcendental reference to the transcendental and openness to, therefore, to sanctifying grace. So therefore, he says that the third stage of human speciation would be the stage at which a theological human comes into existence, and that would be a group of individuals that have an eternal destiny, they have a sense of transcendental, and they are capable of receiving supernatural grace. And he claims that, first of all, those three types, the claim is this: simultaneously, there may be both simply biological human beings, philosophical human beings, and theological human beings. And therefore, being a theological human being doesn't prevent you from being, biologically speaking, a human being. So you can still procreate with human beings. He uses the name human beings that are not theological human beings, but you can still procreate with them because they are biological human beings and even philosophical human beings. So therefore, they have judgment, thought, free choice, and therefore you connect to those animals, and you can still procreate with them. And therefore, by making an agreement that a form of bestiality is possible for the first Homo sapiens, we then avoid the problem of this very narrow bottleneck effect, because there is a larger population of biological and philosophical human beings, where first theological human being comes into existence, where for him, this final step is, even though this is a moment or the change where we observe the theological change, he still claims that there is something that corresponds to it in a biological material, so that he claims that probably it happens through one particular genetic mutation. Now, Camille Miller was actually the first one to think in this way, but he did not develop this complex terminology. He claimed that Adam and Eve coexisted within a wider biologically human population, but he claims that the final step of hominization was not a biological change, but just an infuse of sanctifying grace. Now, I find this position problematic. This is just one quotation from him, where he says that through the successive then unions of those descendants of several primitive couples, a very limited number of generations would be enough for all men to be descended from the first man of which Genesis speaks. So he says this is still monogenism, but less strict, but equally efficacious. Today we call this position theological monogenism within biological polygenism. So in my opinion, the difficulty of his position is this. Well, if he claims that this transition is just adding supernatural grace, the difficulty then would be, if this is just the gift of grace that is being added, that would mean that you already have human beings who have immortal human souls, because supernatural grace is supernatural. So naturally, everything should be there. So then you would have, well, natura pura, where the classical theology says natura pura never existed. It's just a theoretical concept, because from the very beginning, human beings had the divine grace and preternatural gifts. Also, if you claim that to become a human being, they need to receive the supernatural grace, well, that seems to suggest that supernatural grace is an integral part of a human nature, which is problematic within the debate on and conversation on nature and grace. And eventually, yes, if one is true, then his position leans towards polygenism, I think, or maybe you could use this term, which I've mentioned, theological monogenism, within biological polygenism. So the most recent version of the same argument is offered by Kenneth Kemp, who is a philosopher, and he claims, so now first he argues against the view presented by Alexander. He is skeptical about Alexander's view where everything hinges on this one particular mutation. He says this is a strange idea because it would have to spontaneously affect two organisms, male and female. Well, I answered to his criticism saying, why presuppose that the mutation in one organism would not be enough on the account of the subsequent interbreeding with hominins that produces fully human offspring, where it is enough, let's say, if there's just one Adam, he can interbreed with hominins and produce fertile offspring, which is human, Homo sapiens. So why not assume that a mutation in just one organism suffices? And then why assume that the same mutation could not actually occur in two organisms, when today we know that many mutations are very specific, targeting precise loci or loci in particular parts of genome. Okay, so Kenneth Kemp argues against this particular this understanding of the last stage in Alexander's account, and he says that his proposition is this. So we begin with a population of about 5,000 hominids. Well, he still uses the term hominids. Today we say hominins. And God selects two of them and endows them with intellects by creating for them rational souls. So he comes back to the language of God creating human souls for those hominins who then can procreate still with those biological and philosophical other human beings and produce new Homo sapiens. Now, I emphasized that on this scenario, we have God who arbitrarily and without reference to any biological change selects two hominins and endows them with intellect by creating for them rational souls. So it is not Muller's claim where supernatural grace comes and is the final stage. No, it is this time in Kemp's understanding a human soul that is sent by God and or influxed by God. And this is the language actually Kenneth Kemp uses, influx of the soul. Now, I claim that Kemp's proposition, for the reasons that actually I discussed in the first part of this lecture, is what? First, the problem is that it is voluntaristic. So it depends on God's arbitrary decision without a particular natural condition that enables the final step of hominization to occur. I think it's dualistic again, which I would criticize. Because human souls, it seems like they are added to otherwise almost rational or almost theological human beings, which is, I argue, not acceptable from the Aristotelian Thomistic point of view. And also metaphysically, this is metaphysically dubious because, again, it suggests this unusual substantial change where we have hominins, adult hominins, and soul is being like infused into those entities. Now, concerning 2 and 3, Kemp could easily amend his position, I claim, saying that simply God creates the first human souls and that actual is primary matter, as I said in the first part of this lecture. But I think that the first charge becomes a problem because divine voluntarism, typical of William of Ockham and some strains of post-Reformation theology, is foreign to Aquinas. So I speak from the Aristotelian Thomistic point of view, and my claim would be that this is a problem because for Aquinas, God's agency always takes into account the nature of things and works through them as secondary and instrumental causes. So in this natural part of coming into existence of human beings, my claim is that God pays attention to what happens in nature and he wants to work through that and not voluntaristically bringing human beings into existence. So I argue that God's direct creation of the first human soul or souls corresponded to the proper disposition of primary matter within the complex process of speciation, as well as it corresponded to the procreative action of particular hominins, which enabled their gametes to meet and merge in fertilization. And the latter, this substantial change, this fertilization is a substantial change that gave origin to the first modern human being or beings. And I claim it was possible once again because of some decisive natural change in the biological material that prepared or disposed this biological material and the primary matter that underline it, to enter such change in which the first human being came into existence. Consequently, to conclude, I claim, well, I would distance, if I was to defend monogenetic scenario to begin with, because I don't want to say I wholeheartedly embrace and defend it. If I was to defend it from the classical Aristotelian Thomistic point of view, I would be very skeptical about this voluntaristic picture offered by Kemp. I would lean more towards the Alexander's position, where there is a correspondence between what happens in biological material and God creating the first human soul that enters the human, that actualizes the first primary matter in the first human being. Because the one other argument which I find crucial, when we use this dualistic language of there being animal and then God creating the soul, we may sometimes, well, it doesn't have to, it doesn't need to, but it may suggest that the soul like comes from somewhere, whereas human souls, they don't pre-exist for even a split of a second before there is a human being. And this is actually the teaching of the church. Souls never pre-exist. They can subsist as substances after we die. This is really weird, metaphysically speaking, but we believe that it is possible, and this is the revelation that teaches us about that. But they never pre-exist. This is monogenetic scenario. I say if I was to defend it, then I would do it in this way. Last thing I will do, I have 1 more minute. There are also very interesting arguments in favor of polygenism, which are also theological arguments, and therefore I believe that the conversation is open and should be open. And I will just mention them so that we are not left here with just monogenetic scenario and an argument in favor of it. Those who are in favor of polygenism, they say, well, let's be honest, if we read the account of Genesis, we already have a community in sin. There's Adam and Eve, and actually Eve is the first one to commit sin. So what's the problem then for theology if we have a community of 2 committing a sin to have a community of 5,000 committing simultaneously together a sin with like a head of a herd in person of, let's say, an alpha male Adam. Exegetes, they say that Adam, I believe those of you who are theologians, you know it, Adam means human nature, at least in the first 3 or maybe even in the first 4 chapters of Genesis. So you may reinterpret it in this, those accounts in this way. St. John speaks about the sin of the world. So all those who speak about the collective nature of sin, they find here a reference to look into. And definitely the interpretation of Romans chapter 5, verse 12, where Vetus Latina version available for Augustine says that sin passed to all in Adam, in whom all have sinned, whereas today we know that the more appropriate translation is that death passed to all because all have sinned. So this is a dramatically different translation. And then the question is, what do we do with this in terms of the entire theology of sin? And this is a huge and another conversation, but it is, this argument is also being used by those who are in favor of polygenism. And their last very strong and important argument is an argument about the interpretation of humani generis. And Kenneth Kemp, actually, he spent a considerable amount of time working in the archives of the Vatican. He worked on all 4, I believe, or 5 drafts of humani generis. And he wrote a paper. I don't want to, because I happened to be a reviewer of that paper, and I spoke to him about all this. It's an upcoming paper in Scienza et Fides, the Polish journal on science and religion. A wonderful paper where he shows, a short disclaimer, I hope you will still be feel invited to read the paper, where he shows where the document at the beginning was much more stronger in its claim against polygenism. It ended up being much less strong on anti-polygenetic account. And then also Kenneth Kemp shows how after 5 years after the publication of the document, there was a movement here in Rome in the Holy Office to actually make this claim more specific. And I will not tell you what happened because you wouldn't like to go to that paper. But this is the argument on again on the side of those who are in favor of polygenism. Therefore, that the conversation is not closed by the Pope, and there is still space for a conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Mariusz, for a very lightning talk. So we have time for some questions. So maybe if we could start with Father Alan.
Thank you, Father. I have one question. I hope I got everything in. And also, first I want to ask, would it be a kind of an oxymoron to say that there is a creation ex nihilo by God, the rational soul, at some point in conception, which it is operating upon two gametes, which already have a certain determination within themselves. So there's kind of a contradiction there between the material disposition that these gametes are importing into the conception, and then the soul that is originating from the part of God. There would that entail that those two gametes would have to have some corresponding dispositions or features to God's created ex nihilo act. My second question is, in your criticism to the SEM or your clarification to the semi-naturalistic view, could we say that the biological development of the body enabled the rational soul, which was created always there, enabled the rational soul to operate better, it enabled the rational soul to function? Because it happens that that the rational soul is can operate as a rational soul because of the matter of its semi-naturalistic. And if it is impeded by the bodily organs, if the bodily organs are not functioning, then the rational soul is not destroyed, but its operations might be hindered. So could we say that biological evolution in the body allowed the rational soul to operate more perfectly?
Thank you. With regards, with trying to answer the first question first things first. So if somebody claims that substantial soul, as a human soul, rational as a substantial form, it operates on those gametes. I don't like this language because it doesn't operate on the gametes. The gametes they come together, and then it operates. It actualizes primary matter, and then so there are no gametes anymore. There is a substantial change there, and this is precisely when. So for it to happen, so that a new substance comes into existence, there must be a new substantial form. And it doesn't act. So again, I would try to, maybe I'm wrong, but I always emphasize that substantial form is a supernatural, is a metaphysical principle. And I think the problem of the language that we oftentimes use is that we have this metaphysical principle and we want to operate it on the physical principle of material, tangible stuff, which I think it's oxymoron, it's wrong, because it is a metaphysical principle which never exists by itself, and if it operates, to use your language, it operates on primary matter in a way so that this particular entity with particular dispositions comes and has those particular dispositions. And therefore, in this way, I would defend my position against the claim that that substantial form operates on some sort of secondary matter. And I guess this is the answer. I hope it also answers the second question, where obviously substantial form actualizes primary matter in a human being, right? And there is a human being. Okay, it's obvious that it has teleology proper to it, but it can be, it's a suppositional teleology. It may not be realized like fully, the potency that I have in me as a human being. But then it is, so you may say that they are external efficient causes of it, but these are external efficient causes that hinder or interrupt not again the action of substantial human soul, substantial form, which is human soul, on my body, but then it hinders the development of this one being, an organism, which is right here, which is again not two things that came together and are there, and then one will leave this thing and the other will be left. No, what will be left will not be a human body. It will be a cadaver. So that's how I understand it. I don't know if it helps or not.
Down here, thank you, sister, for your work. Up and down.
The soul is the substantial form of life, and right, and that's another principle. So does that mean that it's this substantial form of the sense which is enjoying the expectations of the metaphysical principle?
Well, I mean, this is another completely different and difficult question, and I'm not an expert in eschatology at all. And it is the entire question, first of all, what happens with us after our death. So we are very weird creatures, because all the things that come into existence in the world, God creates, in my understanding, stuff ex nihilo, boom, it is there, and everything that happens afterwards is transformation of an already existing matter. So substantial forms are being educed from the potency of this matter. Our souls are created, so we are part of natural process, and yet the soul is created. And then when we die, usually when animals die, there is a substantial change, and that's it. They're done. That's it. A completely new substance comes into existence, which is a cadaver. The soul doesn't survive it. That's it. Whereas in our case, how do we classify it? Is it a substantial change? In a way, we want to say yes, because as persons we cease to exist. But then at the same time, our souls survive. So it seems like it is less than substantial change, but more than the accidental change. And we actually, I think we don't have a clear category how to describe it. And then the one thing is whether, first, we survive as persons. I tend to think we do not. We survive as subsisting human souls, but they are not person, because person is this. Right? So the first question is what survives? And if then souls are already enjoying beatific vision, what would that mean? Aquinas tries to find an answer to it, saying that their primary and most important action is cognition and knowledge. And then they still, usually I need my senses because knowledge comes through senses, but he says, God then gives to those souls infused knowledge like he gives to the angels. And yet human souls, they want to be, again, I don't use the language, go back to their bodies. I use the language that I say that human souls, they want to inform primary matter once again in an organic human body. This is what they want, because what is natural for their cognition is cognition through the senses. So then maybe you could say they can enjoy beatific vision because God gives them those, because like, this is really interesting. We would, I think there is a reason why we will be resurrected in our bodies. So there will be something about our knowledge in God that still will come through senses. I don't know why and how, but I guess this is important. Therefore, maybe God provides this lacking something as he does like with all other kinds of knowledge, with this infused images that he provides to those souls in their expectation for the final resurrection, where they will enjoy it continuously in the resurrected, I don't like resurrected bodies, resurrected persons. I mean, I think this is important. This is a person, not a body. I have a body, I have a material and a spiritual aspect to what I am, but I am not body and the soul as two separate substances. I think that the dualistic language is pervasive in Christianity with Augustine and ever since, and we don't know how to get rid of this. Aquinas tries and we after him, but I think we are not doing great.
If I could cut into the question. I think I agree. So I agree, Aquinas is very much avoiding the kind of substance dualism that you're pushing against. But Aquinas also famously believed in delayed hominization, where in his understanding of embryology, so he's very clear that there is only ever one substantial form, and that in the maturity of the person, this is a spiritual. It includes spiritual powers, and so the rational soul is immediately created by God, and yet he has a period in the process of embryology where that which is going to be a human person has first vegetative and then animal soul, and then receives the fullness of the rational soul. How's that work in your thought?
Yeah, the way, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understand it, there were interpretations of that saying that you can have more than one substantial soul in an entity, but I think he rejects it and we reject that. So that would be a process where you have, I guess, three different entities. You have first, a vegetative soul, which is like a plant creature, which is like a plant. Then we have an animal, and then we have human being. And then Aquinas would probably argue that because of what it is, what it is to become, you have to have proper reverence and treat it as something that will become a human being. But I guess he would agree that it is not a human being yet, which is, as we know, it is even being used by pro-abortionists today, right? For the very same reason, right? So therefore, I would say that it doesn't challenge my view. I don't see how it would challenge my view. Still, there is a certain point where there is a substantial change, I guess, where human being actually comes into existence, and it is, at the same. Process philosophers would love it, I guess, because they would say, well, there you are. You have process where you cannot actually say. They may actually argue you cannot say that at this point it is still a plant, and now it is an animal, and now it is a human being. Maybe it's just a continuous flux. Whereas Aquinas actually is trying to be more specific, right? He says on which day it happens, more or less.
Maybe time for one more question. So here.
This is probably not a very coherent question on the issue, but Alexander postulated, from my understanding, in the period of growing hominization eventually with theological beings. And I think earlier you showed that there was some form of evidence of 200,000 years of biological human beings. There was 50,000 year evidence of some form of religious expression found in artifacts found near biological beings. Would it be possible to postulate that in the light of this potential biological philosophical beings that say Adam and Eve were the first human beings 50,000 years ago to have taken on that theological human beings, and then after their fall, all the human beings who existed around the same time then gave birth to theological human beings, so that they were contemporaneous with say Cain and Abel.
I don't. I'm sorry. I don't think I understood.
Okay, so if can we postulate that Adam and Eve were the first two theological beings,
yes,
50,000 years ago?
Yes.
after their fall and their conception of Cain and Abel, would it be possible to postulate that when Cain and Abel were alive, any sort of polygenetic human beings that existed at the same time who were philosophical human beings, would it be possible to postulate that they then gave birth to theological human beings maybe at the same time as Cain and Abel? So Adam and Eve were the first human beings who were theological men.
But like we have Cain and Abel, and there are theological human beings, and what about the rest? You mean that they become with them?
So Adam and Eve are theological human beings. They give birth to Cain and Abel, and then all of the contemporaneous philosophical human beings then give birth to theological human beings.
I mean, well, this is an interesting question, but according to the teaching of the classical teaching of the church, the original sin is transmitted through generation, so they wouldn't become human beings without being truly generated from somebody who is a truly human being. So they could not become human beings, for example, by the fact that they participate in the sin. Let's say they see the example of Adam and they see, at least according to the traditional teaching of the church, because you will find theologians who would claim we could maybe think over it once again and maybe accept the claim that, as you say, for example, they saw the act of Adam and they just followed his example, and then everybody who was born of them was already a human being and a fallen human being. So, but so there's several, interesting and sometimes wild suggestions in theology on how to reinterpret original sin.
Okay. I think with that, I think that's for